It was a typical weekday morning, the kind where everything just seems to be in sync. The sun had just come up, casting that soft, golden hue over the neighborhood, and the air was still crisp from the night before. I had just stepped out onto the porch with my coffee in hand, feeling pretty good about the day ahead. We had parked our car right in front of our house the night before, nothing out of the ordinary. It was in our usual spot, aligned neatly with the curb, not blocking any driveway, not over a fire hydrant. Just a clean, well-maintained car sitting legally outside of our home. Then I saw her. Now, I don't usually jump to conclusions about people, but if you live in an HOA-managed neighborhood long enough, you start to recognize a certain type of person. This one had it all. A tight bun, pressed polo shirt tucked into beige slacks, and those ever-present oversized sunglasses that practically covered her entire face. She walked with that kind of exaggerated authority, the kind where you can tell someone really, really likes having a clipboard. She wasn't walking her dog, wasn't getting her mail. No, she was on patrol. And I already knew who she was before she said a word. She was Karen. Every neighborhood has one. That one person who acts like the HOA is a badge and they're the sheriff of some suburban frontier. You could feel it coming. I watched her make her way slowly down the sidewalk, eyes scanning left and right like a hawk looking for prey. And when she spotted our car, she stopped. Not a casual glance. Not a just taking note moment. She froze in place like she had found the jackpot. At first, I thought maybe she was just checking something, or maybe she recognized the make and model and wanted to say something neighborly. Wishful thinking. She pulled out her phone, squinting at the screen as she took a picture of our license plate. Then another of the back of the car. Then a wide shot of it with our house in the background like she was building a whole case for a courtroom nobody asked for. I didn't say anything yet. I was watching from a distance, hoping this would be one of those moments that fizzles out without drama. But Karen wasn't here for peace. She was here on a mission. She took a few more steps, circling the car slowly like a detective surveying a crime scene. She pulled out her phone again, this time making a call. I couldn't hear everything she was saying, but I definitely caught a few key phrases: unauthorized vehicle, blocking common property, and the kicker, I'm requesting immediate towing. That's when I realized she wasn't just taking notes or checking with the HOA. She was actively trying to get our car towed. I couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. Our car was in perfect condition. Not an eyesore, not leaking oil, not sitting there for days like some abandoned project. It was parked overnight in front of our house. Still, Karen was now pacing a bit, walking back and forth, clearly waiting for someone on the other end of the line to give her the answer she wanted. She even waved down a neighbor passing by, gesturing to the car as if trying to get a witness on her side. I couldn't hear the entire conversation, but I did catch her voice rising a little, emphasizing that this was a repeat violation and that these people think they can just do whatever they want. These people. That's what she said. That told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't about a car. This wasn't about some petty rule being bent. This was about control, power, the illusion of authority that people like Karen love to wield whenever they feel even slightly ignored. She finally ended the call and stood there, arms crossed, watching the car like it might sprout legs and sprint off. It was such a bizarre level of intensity for a car parked quietly on the street. But that's what you deal with when you live in a place where the HOA isn't just a committee, it's a hierarchy of self-appointed power brokers. Karen pulled a little notepad out of her bag next, jotting something down. Maybe a license plate, maybe the date and time, maybe our address. It was clear she was preparing to make this official, or at least make it feel that way. She gave the car one more long, slow glare, like she had personally been wronged by its presence. Then she turned and began marching down the street again, probably off to her next target. All I could do was shake my head. I hadn't said a word yet. I didn't need to. I knew that soon the situation was going to take a turn, one Karen absolutely didn't see coming. Ask ChatGPT. Karen didn't waste time once she made her decision. After her phone call, she doubled down with a sense of authority that only someone on a self-appointed power trip could exude. She marched straight up to the front of our car and stood there for a moment, arms crossed as if her glare alone would compel the car to vanish. Her posture was rigid, her jaw tight, and even from a distance I could tell she was mentally preparing her script for whatever confrontation she was hoping to trigger. Then she pulled out her phone again, scrolling through what I assumed was the HOA's digital handbook or maybe just her own collection of selectively interpreted rules. With one hand on her hip and the other tapping furiously on the screen, she clearly felt like she was building a case worthy of Supreme Court review. The irony was, the car wasn't doing anything wrong. It was parked legally in front of our own house, not obstructing traffic, driveways, or walkways. But that didn't matter to her. Karen wasn't looking for a violation. She was looking for a problem. A few moments later, she waved over a man in an HOA maintenance truck who happened to be driving by. He rolled down his window, probably expecting a question about landscaping or garbage pickup. Instead, she leaned in with the urgency of someone reporting a robbery. She gestured sharply toward the car, talking fast, animated, even pointing toward our house. The guy in the truck looked confused. He glanced at the car, then back at her, then back at the car again. He looked like he wanted no part of whatever drama she was manufacturing. Karen, though, wasn't deterred. She pulled out her phone yet again and started scrolling through photos she had taken, clearly trying to show the man some sort of evidence. Her voice carried just enough for me to catch snippets of her escalating tirade. It's been there for 3 nights now, not even in the driveway, they know better, and the clincher, I've already submitted a report. She kept referring to Section 14C and non-compliant vehicle storage even though, to my knowledge, no such section existed, or if it did, it had nothing to do with our situation. This wasn't some rusted-out junker leaking fluid onto the pavement. It was a well-kept vehicle, registered and insured, simply parked where any homeowner should reasonably expect to park. But to Karen, none of that mattered. The moment she decided the car didn't belong, it became public enemy number 1. Not content with just reporting us to some HOA rep, she began taking notes again. She walked around the car like a building inspector, writing down whatever details she could find. I saw her crouch slightly to read the VIN through the windshield, at least, she tried. She seemed frustrated when she couldn't get a clear angle. Then she shifted gears and started photographing the tire position, the curb, the house number. Every little thing that might give her case the illusion of legitimacy. The whole act was almost theatrical. She wasn't just documenting. She was performing. Karen had assigned herself the role of neighborhood enforcer, and she was playing it with gusto. She even pulled out a folded piece of paper from her purse. A printed copy of what looked like HOA bylaws, highlighted and annotated with sticky notes. She waved it in the air as she talked to another neighbor who happened to walk by, trying to recruit support for her cause. When the neighbor seemed uninterested, Karen huffed and turned her attention back to the car. She paced in front of it like she was guarding a crime scene. Her phone buzzed, and she answered immediately, her tones suddenly more formal. From what I could gather, she was now speaking to someone from a towing company. I caught phrases like immediate dispatch, non-compliant, and resident has been warned previously, all of which were false. No one had contacted us. No warnings, no emails, no calls, nothing. She gave the address loudly and clearly, as if that alone sealed the deal. Then she hung up and stood back, almost proud of herself. In her mind, she had just executed a flawless operation. She began pacing again, likely waiting for the tow truck to arrive, arms crossed, foot tapping, checking her phone every 30 seconds. She didn't notice me standing on the porch yet. To her, the car was the main character in this drama. The rest of us were just background noise. While I had been watching everything unfold from the porch, sipping what was now a lukewarm cup of coffee, my wife had been inside, completely unaware that a neighborhood saga was taking shape just outside our front door. That changed quickly. I casually walked back inside, mentioned that Karen was outside trying to have our car towed, and waited for the reaction. I didn't need to say anything more. My wife didn't panic, didn't rush. She simply raised an eyebrow and calmly put down the book she was reading. Now, it's important to understand something about my wife. She doesn't do drama, but she does do precision. She's the kind of person who keeps every document, every email, every receipt neatly organized and accessible. Her calm is not passive, it's practiced. She doesn't raise her voice. She doesn't need to. She knows how to make her presence felt without making a scene. So when she stood up and walked to the front door, there was no hesitation, no anxiety, just a quiet confidence that said, "Let's go fix this." She stepped outside, no shoes, just socks on the porch like she had only come out to water the plants. But there was something in her posture that shifted the whole energy of the scene. Karen didn't notice her at first, too busy standing near the car, phone in one hand, paperwork in the other, pacing like a mall cop waiting for backup. But the second my wife took a step onto the walkway, Karen's head turned, her eyes narrowing just slightly, sensing that something was about to shift. My wife didn't raise her voice. She didn't rush over to confront anyone. She simply stood on the walkway, arms by her sides, watching. Her presence alone seemed to throw Karen off balance for a moment. That brief moment of confusion flickered across Karen's face, the kind of moment when someone realizes they might not have the upper hand after all. My wife didn't give her the satisfaction of jumping into an argument. She just stood there with that composed, unreadable look that made it impossible to know what she was thinking. Karen tried to maintain her momentum. She took a few confident steps toward the car and said something that sounded rehearsed, something about repeat violations and imminent tow. My wife simply nodded as if she were listening to a stranger on the train talk about their weekend. Then she walked calmly over to the car and examined it herself as if seeing it for the first time. She checked the distance from the curb, confirmed there were no posted signs, and tilted her head as if genuinely trying to understand the issue. Then she turned to Karen and asked one single, surgical question: "Under what clause of the HOA agreement do you believe this violates code?" It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't sarcastic. But it cut straight to the heart of Karen's bluff. Karen blinked, shuffled the papers in her hand, and began flipping through her printed HOA documents, desperately trying to locate the magical clause that would give her authority. My wife waited patiently, not saying another word, watching Karen struggle with her own evidence like a student who hadn't done the reading. The silence started to get uncomfortable. Karen tried to recover, pointing to something highlighted and saying it had to do with unauthorized street parking and non-resident vehicles. My wife didn't flinch. She simply asked if Karen had confirmed the registration of the vehicle. Karen paused again, clearly not expecting that. My wife then clarified, without raising her voice, that the vehicle was in her name, registered at this exact address, and in compliance with every documented rule of the community charter. Karen stammered a bit, still clutching her documents like a life raft, but my wife wasn't done. She asked if Karen had followed proper HOA protocol for issuing a complaint. Had she notified the homeowner? Filed a written warning? Initiated a compliance request through the board? Karen's mouth opened but no sound came out. Then, casually, almost like a side note, my wife mentioned that she had recently reviewed the HOA charter herself, along with the land use agreements and board structure, considering her vested interest in the property. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. The weight of that last sentence hung in the air like a thundercloud, but without any thunder. Just tension. And silence. When she dropped that bombshell that she and I jointly hold the deed to the entire block, the world seemed to shift. It wasn't dramatic, no mic drop moment or thunderclap. Instead, she said it in a calm, measured tone, just flatly stating the truth as though someone had asked her what the weather was like outside. This was no over-the-top reveal, but rather a statement of fact. "By the way, we own this block." And with those words, everything changed. Karen's face drained of color, her posture shifted mid-sentence. Her shoulders sagged slightly as if someone had cut the strings on her marionette act. It's one thing to enforce HOA bylaws when you're a neighbor with a clipboard. It's an entirely different thing when you find out the person you're browbeating is not just any resident but the literal owner of the land through proper legal channels. No one had ever put her in that position before. You could almost see the panic in her eyes as she realized the dynamic had reversed. She wasn't steering the conversation anymore. She was suddenly an interloper in her own power play. The smug confidence drained away, replaced by confusion. She sputtered a few words, something about rules, compliance, someone else being responsible, but even her voice sounded smaller, uncertain, lacking conviction. My wife remained utterly composed, letting those touchy little excuses fall flat without so much as a nod. She didn't raise an eyebrow, didn't jab a finger. She just let the revelation speak for itself, the sound of authority in the silence. Karen shuffled her feet, Her earlier energy had vanished. She looked like she was trying to figure out where to stand next. Her phone hand found her purse as though seeking an escape plan. The shift in body language was telling. Karen no longer stood in a resting poise. She was hunched slightly, hands clasped together in front of her, head down. She kept staring at our car, willing it to be a prop in some imaginary reality where she still held sway. But it wasn't just her. Anyone within earshot felt it. It became obvious that this was no longer a neighborhood squabble. It had become a power recalibration. The neighborhood landscape, previously guided by HOA rulebooks and patrols, had been upended by a single sentence. You can't tow what we own. Neighbors who had lingered on their porches slowly appeared, catching bits of the exchange. Their attention shifted from mild curiosity, "What's going on over there?" to wide-eyed disbelief as the reveal sank in. A hush fell, the kind that precedes a collective mental reset. Everyone reevaluated their position as if the mortgage signs in their front yards momentarily lost significance in the path of this newer, deeper claim. My wife turned and gestured to me, calmly stating that yes, the property was fully theirs, documented through the developer channels and recorded with the county. She explained, almost conversationally, that she'd acquired full title through a purchase agreement executed over a year ago, a matter of public record. The words "public record" further unraveling Karen's composure, and I could see her internal gears trying desperately to spin up a counter-strategy. But how do you argue with the public record? Karen tried again, sort of. She cleared her throat, adjusted her glasses, and tried to focus back on some clause in the HOA bylaws. But the bylaws didn't hold weight here. Ownership spoke louder. The streets, the driveways, the right to park, they were all on their property. No HOA rule could override landowner privilege. Encore attempts to find contradictions in bylaws came out as vague references, trailing off. She looked around, eyes flicking from my wife to neighbors and back again, searching for camaraderie or backup. None was forthcoming. Everyone stared silently, hanging on my wife's words. Meanwhile, I stood off to the side, marveling at how effortlessly the tone of the whole thing had shifted. It wasn't confrontational, it was quiet, factual, powerful. Not about raising voices or scoring points, but simply stating truths. The only clamps Karen had on the situation were the ones she'd imposed on herself, and now they had snapped shut. As if sensing the tide turning decisively, Karen's phone buzzed again. She looked at it, probably a text from the HOA president or some prior reviewer wondering why things weren't resolved yet. But she didn't answer. Instead, she tucked the phone away, her hands folded together as though bracing for something, not sure what exactly, but clearly aware that things had gone unexpectedly sideways. The silence hung for a moment longer than anyone expected. Karen, still standing rigidly by the curb, seemed to be computing everything she had just learned. The clipboard that once served as her badge of authority now looked more like a security blanket. She clutched it close to her chest, as if holding onto it would somehow restore the power dynamic that had just been obliterated. She glanced down at the papers again, flipping through them with shaking fingers, searching for something, anything that might give her back some ground to stand on. But every line of HOA regulation she had highlighted now felt irrelevant in the face of property ownership. The HOA board members began to arrive, one by one, responding either to Karen's earlier calls or to the sudden murmurings spreading throughout the neighborhood. First came Jim, the board's secretary, a retired engineer with a habit of over-explaining minor issues. Then came Linda, the treasurer, who usually kept to herself unless money was involved. They walked up cautiously, already sensing that something was off. Karen tried to intercept them before they reached our driveway, launching into a hushed but urgent explanation of what had transpired. She gestured toward our car, pointed in the direction of our front door, waved the clipboard for emphasis. Her voice was tight, forced into a brittle tone of authority that was quickly crumbling. Jim gave her a raised eyebrow and said something low, inaudible from where I stood, but clearly skeptical. Linda stood silently with her arms folded, listening intently, her expression unreadable. Neither of them looked eager to get involved, more like people arriving at a fire they were hoping had already burned out. That's when my wife stepped forward again, quiet but firm, and addressed the board directly. There was no aggression, no challenge, just clarity. She greeted them politely and then asked if they were aware of the property deed structure for the block. The question alone seemed to throw them. Jim blinked, glanced at Karen, then back at my wife. The deed structure? He asked, clearly unsure where this was going. My wife calmly explained that the entire block, multiple parcels, had been sold in a bundled private deal during a transitional period between developers. It was perfectly legal and fully documented with the city and county. She offered to forward copies of the documentation if they wished to review it. She even mentioned the zoning maps and property overlays that confirmed the lines of ownership, drawing a clear boundary between HOA-managed areas and privately held property. The mood among the board members shifted almost immediately. Karen's fire and brimstone performance from earlier had lost its momentum, and now it was being replaced with quiet, awkward recalibration. Jim scratched his head, muttered something about needing to check the master file, and Linda, ever practical, asked if she could take a picture of the deed page. My wife nodded, already pulling it up on her phone. In seconds, she was showing them the official document, and both board members stared at it with the same expression of someone realizing they'd been arguing the wrong side of the equation. Karen, meanwhile, stood off to the side, no longer speaking. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and her eyes darted between the board and my wife, trying to gauge where things had gone wrong. But it was clear she had pushed too far, too fast, and without checking her facts. Her assumption that she could steamroll another resident with a half-read copy of the HOA rulebook had completely backfired. The board thanked my wife, and Jim, doing his best to salvage the moment, awkwardly offered to review procedures with the rest of the HOA leadership. It was a weak attempt to save face, but no one called him on it. The board members slowly began to drift away, clearly uninterested in taking Karen's side now that the facts were laid bare. Karen didn't follow them. She lingered, holding her clipboard like a shield, but the audience she had hoped to impress was gone. The neighbors who had gathered around began to shift, some returning to their yards, others murmuring among themselves. The narrative had changed right in front of them, and it was obvious. My wife hadn't yelled, hadn't made a scene, she had simply presented the truth. And truth, when backed by facts and composure, has a way of clearing a room faster than any argument. The tow truck finally arrived, a large diesel-powered statement of escalation that seemed to scream authority even before the driver stepped out. Its engine roared as it rumbled down the street, turning every head on the block. It was clear the driver expected some sort of situation, maybe a car blocking a fire hydrant, a wreck in a no-parking zone, something dramatic enough to justify his presence. Instead, he found Karen standing alone by a perfectly legal car parked calmly in front of the very home it belonged to, clutching her clipboard like it was a police badge. He stepped down from the cab, glancing first at Karen, then at the vehicle, then at my wife and me standing by our front steps. There was a pause. A long one. You could see the mental math happening in real time. This was not the scenario he'd been prepped for. Karen was already moving toward him, talking quickly, pointing toward the car, waving her hands as she rattled off some kind of summary about repeat violations and urgent removal. The driver looked confused, then cautious. He turned back to the car, walked around it once, checked for any city-issued citations, fire lane markings, or obstruction issues. Finding none, he approached my wife and asked, politely, if this was her vehicle. She answered yes, handed over the registration from her phone without hesitation, and calmly explained that the car was parked legally on private property. She even gestured toward the property deed, still open on her phone's screen from the earlier conversation with the HOA board. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't posture. She simply showed him what he needed to see. The tow truck driver squinted at the document, then back at the car. He glanced at Karen, then back at us, and then shook his head with a low whistle. "I'm gonna need to make a call," he said. He stepped away, dialing his dispatcher, and walked off to the side as he spoke quietly into the phone. From the bits we could hear, it was clear he was relaying that the vehicle was parked on privately owned property by the registered owner and that he didn't see a valid basis for removal. Karen stood frozen, her face tightening with each word of that call. Her entire plan, so carefully laid out, was unraveling in front of her. She had envisioned this moment differently. She had seen herself as the enforcer, the one who brought order to the unruly. She had imagined the car getting towed while neighbors nodded in approval. But the reality playing out now looked nothing like that. The tow truck driver wasn't backing her. The HOA board had already backed off. The neighbors were watching in disbelief. And worst of all, her target wasn't flustered or angry, just calmly standing there, prepared. The call ended. The driver approached her, expression neutral, and told her flatly that he wouldn't be towing the vehicle. There was no legal basis for removal. The registration was valid. The property was owned by the very person she'd been reporting. "I'm not getting involved in this," he said, almost apologetically. Karen opened her mouth, tried to protest, but nothing coherent came out. The driver gave a small shrug, then climbed back into his truck and slowly backed away, leaving behind a cloud of diesel and a woman who no longer had any cards to play. Karen didn't speak. She didn't look at us. She turned on her heel and walked down the sidewalk, her clipboard pressed to her chest like a life preserver, her strides faster than before. Not quite a retreat, but definitely not a victory march either. She disappeared down the block, probably to regroup, reframe the narrative in her head, maybe file another complaint that would end up ignored. Whatever the case, her campaign had come to a screeching halt, not with confrontation, but with quiet facts and calm confidence. My wife turned back toward the house, unfazed, as if none of it had surprised her. She wasn't smug. She wasn't triumphant. She was simply steady, the way she always is. For her, this wasn't about showing off or humiliating anyone. It was about standing firm in the truth, knowing the rules better than the person trying to weaponize them. And in that moment, she didn't need anyone's validation. She already had the receipts, the title, the law, and the facts on her side.